Hello, welcome to the Resilience Research Group's podcast series. I'm Angel, your host today, and a master's student in psychology at UCL. We have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Roz Shafran from UCL. Today, she'll discuss her research on perfectionism, low-intensity interventions for young people, and her efforts to build capacity for evidence-based interventions. Professor Shafran, thank you for joining us. Could you first tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
So I'm an emeritus professor of translational psychology at UCL. And what that means is that my job has been to translate the research into clinical practice. So I'm a clinical psychologist, but I'm also a researcher. And I have now retired, which is why I'm an emeritus professor, but still attached to UCL.
Thank you for that. And your research has greatly influenced how we understand perfectionism in mental health. What initially drew you to this area?
So as an undergraduate, I was taught by Paul Sulkowskis, who's done a lot of work in obsessive compulsive disorder. And I knew after undergraduate that I wanted to travel, but I hadn't have the money to pay for it, and I didn't want to work to save up the money. So I decided what I would do is I would try and work abroad. And I wrote to everybody that I'd heard of in all of my undergraduate training in America, because I'd met somebody on a Camp America the previous summer and I decided I wanted to be in North America. And so I wrote to everyone I ever heard of, and one person wrote back and said that they would offer me a job if I could get the visa. So I was working at Great Ormond Street at the time because I'd volunteered there in my summer holidays, and they kindly, Brian Lask there, kindly put on the visa application form that I would be coming back to do a PhD, which was stretching the truth slightly. So there are lots of these kinds of coincidences and good fortune along the way. And then I worked with this professor in Canada called Jack Rackman, who worked in OCD and anxiety disorders. But because I'd worked in eating disorders at Great Ormond Street, I kept that strand. So I had this strand of obsessive compulsive disorder, this strand of eating disorders. And when you work in both of those, really the kind of section in between them is perfectionism. And that's how I became interested in perfectionism particularly. It's quite a long answer, sorry.
It's a very eventful journey for you to actually explore the overlap between different types of conditions and actually settle on a specific area. Now, could you tell us more about over the years, how has your understanding of perfectionism changed from your research or from things you know from the literature?
So originally, the work on perfectionism stemmed when I was in Oxford, and we were seeing lots of perfectionist students with eating disorders. And at that time, there was an enhanced form of cognitive behaviour therapy being developed by Chris Verber and Zafra Cooper, in which perfectionism was seen as a broader form. So not everybody had perfectionism, but for those that did, we wanted to have an intervention. So we developed it to be incorporated into CBTE for eating disorders, but also as a standalone treatment. And we had started off with a student on the DClin Psy course, on the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology course, who conducted a case series. Then we had a PhD student who did a very small randomized control and qualitative interviews. And that caught the attention of some Australian colleagues. And I have to say that, you know, if it wasn't for them, I don't think it would have taken off in quite the way, because they were interested. They had some criticisms of the approach, which I think were really valid, and we took them on board, and we then wrote a book together, evaluated the self-help book, and that got me into some of the kind of access work, which is very much, what's the point of having treatment if people don't get it? People don't often go to therapy for perfectionism. It comes up in the context of other mental health disorders. But what about all the people who are still sort of struggling, maybe don't have a mental health disorder, but still could do with some input? So that's how we kind of got into some of the low intensity or guided self-help work.
Perfect. So you mentioned that some people come in for therapy, but not necessarily for perfectionism. And you also mentioned that cognitive behavioral approaches could be helpful. So in what ways does it differ from standardized CBT approaches for, let's say, depression or anxiety?
Yeah, so I think people are sort of under the view that there is sort of one cognitive behavior therapy and it's just cognitive behavior therapy, but CBT for depression looks very different from CBT for anxiety. And within the anxiety disorders, for example, CBT for social anxiety looks very different from CBT for generalized anxiety disorder. When they have the commonalities, and the commonalities really is at the heart of the kind of difficulty, the conceptual idea is that it's not the situation, it's your interpretation of the situation or your interpretation of your physical sensations or your interpretation of yourself, the world, and others around you. So they do have a sort of a core in common, and that sort of central principle that brings them all together. But actually, the interventions look very different. So for generalized anxiety, there's a real focus on intolerance of uncertainty. For depression, there's lots of focus on behavioral activation and evaluating cognitions. So they're different. And for CBTP, which is developed with Tracy Wade and Sarah Egan for perfectionism, it has that same sort of principle of it's about interpretation. But the real heart of it is the view that it's not about standards, which is what lots of people think perfectionism is. It's not about lowering your standards, but it's about your reaction to failing to meet those standards in terms of how you feel about yourself, judge yourself, or evaluate yourself as a person. So that's really the commonality. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So
Okay.
even though it's working in the same theory and framework, it's got different tailored techniques for different types of conditions. Now, going along the lines of that, apart from tailoring CBT for different conditions, how do we tailor CBT for different age groups or cultural contexts?
This comes up a lot. And I think, again, it's sort of sometimes a bit of a misunderstanding of CBT. So if you have CBT, let's just say take CBT for depression, you might have the same age, the same gender, you might even have a twin, right? Like very, very similar. You still would not be doing exactly the same treatment for one person and another. There are manuals, but those manuals are designed to be used flexibly. And the principle of what you're trying to do is really at the heart, rather than session 1, I need to do this, session 2, I need to do this, session 3, I need to do this, because people haven't read the manuals, they haven't swallowed them and said, okay, and they don't go along neatly in that way. So I think there's something about CBT is still a psychotherapy. It's still a therapy, and it's still about understanding the individual and their perspective and what's maintaining the difficulty for them. So there aren't sort of, I can say there are general rules of, oh, if they're a child, you do it this way. I mean, there's some obvious things in terms of your pace, or if someone's got neurodevelopmental difficulties, then you want to break it down and you want to use visual cues, or you might want to involve a family member. So there are lots of ways in which you can adapt it, but really it's about balancing fidelity to the protocol and flexibility in its application. And that's Phil Kendall's work is about fidelity and flexibility. And every client, every person, you should have a personalized therapy, because no two people are the same.
Thank you for that. I'm just wondering, from your own clinical work or your research, were there any surprising or unexpected findings around perfectionism or your work of supporting people with improving their perfectionism?
I think there have been lots of interesting, sort of surprising things on the way. I remember at the beginning having quite a heated debate, a bit like chicken and egg, about what comes first, the cognition or the behavior. And person I was debating with saying, oh, you need to really change cognition first, because you change the thinking and the interpretation, that will change the emotions and then the feelings. And, you've got thoughts, feelings, behaviors in CBT. But actually also knowing that if you change behavior, that's a really potent way to change beliefs, because you're finding it out for yourself. And I think probably the most surprising or sort of unexpected aspect of it is really how committed I am to that view, that actually you do want to be focusing on behavior and want to change cognition through behavioral experiments primarily, because that really, in my mind, does have the highest evidential value to people. When you've experienced something yourself, then it's memorable. It's not somebody else telling you that you can kind of dismiss. So I think that's been a key part of perfectionism, is really just that aspect. But also, I mean, I'm quite a compliant person, I'd say. I've kind of haven't broken any rules. I was good at school, all of those kinds of things. And yet there seems to be this kind of view that you can't change anything in a therapy. And I really think that's, that becomes very rigid. So I think the idea that you can take these principles and use them flexibly and creatively, and that there's a lot of creativity in any CBT treatment, so that you can get inside that person's head, understand what's going on that makes sense to that person, and then devise ways of testing and evaluating it that are really relevant to the individual.
So tailoring it further, and also there's some debate on, is it the behavior or the cognition that comes first? Now, along those lines, are there any common misconceptions from those who are having high levels of perfectionism, or those that could support them, or in their support networks? Are there any misconceptions about it? Are there any myths about it?
Yeah, so just go back to clarify. It's not so much what comes first, the cognition or behavior, as much as where to intervene first. Because I think that is just, it's an artificial debate. What comes first, really, your thinking or your behavior? They're so intertwined. But where should you intervene first? I think the misconceptions about perfectionism really are about standards and the idea. I mean, it's difficult to engage people. So, for example, you're quite high achieving, right? You're at UCL, you're doing your master's, and you're hosting a podcast on resilience. So, you're pretty up there, doing well on the career trajectory. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? And I think the reason that some of the perfectionism treatments were difficult originally is because the idea that someone would say, it's okay if you don't do so well, you should just, culturally, socially, all around us, there is a pressure to succeed. And that brings with it intrinsic rewards. Success does bring with it financial rewards, social rewards, lots of things. So I think the idea a therapist is going to go in and say, oh, it's okay, you can have low standards and whatever, that's never going to fly. And that's really not what perfectionism treatment's about. It's not about lowering standards. People's standards do come down with treatment, but it's about the reaction to failing to meet those standards. And it's about whether or not you can achieve your goals. You can still do your masters, you can still do the podcast, you can still do anything, but actually it's less stressful, less effortful, less mental health consequences associated with that.
So to summarize, it seems it's not lowering standards, but understanding, or kind of having a balanced perspective of the consequences if you do fail or if you do make a mistake, it seems.
Yeah, it's about the core of our approach is about the over-evaluation, or the over-importance of achieving and success and striving to your self-evaluation. So that if you don't get a good mark, instead of, I haven't got a good mark, what does that mean? What do I need to do differently next time? How can I learn from this, etc.? It's, I'm useless, I'm terrible, nothing I do will ever go right. I should have done this and I should have done that, and next time I'm going to do harder, and in the inability to learn from your mistakes because you're engaged in such self-criticism, because it makes you feel so bad about yourself as a person. So it reflects on you as a person. So I'm useless. I've let everybody down, as opposed to, I didn't do that well on a test. Let me understand that. So it isn't the performance, it's the reaction to that performance and the importance to self-evaluation. And then some of the things that go alongside that in terms of avoidance or repeated checking and things like that, that can maintain the difficulty, and the exhaustion and the lack of sleep, and so on. So those are the things that are targeted in treatment, not let's just lower your standard.
Thank you for that. Now let's move on to the Lucy project, which evaluates a drop in mental health service for young people with long-term conditions, as well as the families in pediatric hospitals and clinics. Could you tell us more about how this service was developed?
So I've got a colleague called Isabel Heyman, Professor Isabel Heyman, who is a child psychiatrist. And so my sort of career trajectory, I was working in Oxford on perfectionism, and then I moved to a job that was about disseminating the evidence-based treatments. And that was at the University of Reading, and that's where we set up training, and that'll be relevant for the later bit of it. But then when I got to Great Ormond Street, which is where I'd started my career, I was working with Isabel Heyman, who was very frustrated that the children who had long-term health conditions at Great Ormond Street and serious long-term health conditions were not getting access to mental health treatment. And we know that they are at risk, that they're vulnerable because of having a physical health problem makes you more at risk. We think there are different pathways to that. Some might be shared genetics, some might be a response to the physical health problem, some might be the mental health problem interacting. I mean, they're all different pathways. But her vision was that every child in the hospital would have immediate access to mental health screening and intervention. And by this point, because of the perfectionism work, I was committed to some self-help books and increasing access in that way. So we put our heads together, and Lucy is named after the Peanuts character, Snoopy, where Lucy had a drop-in centre. She's got her feet on the table in the photoshopped images and sort of charges 5 cents for very bad non-evidence-based advice. We decided we'd make Lucy smile. We photoshopped her so she smiles. She definitely was going to give evidence-based advice. And we got funding from the Beryl Alexander charity, supported by Gosh Children's Charity. And we just did it. We had the volunteers at the hospital were fantastic. We had master's students who were engaged, and we just set up a booth, a bit like the Macmillan Cancer booths, with the inspiration in the reception area of the hospital. So thanks to Estates and Crispin Walking-Lee, who made that possible. And we offered sort of guided self-help interventions delivered by master's students who are trained and others, research assistants, assistant psychologists, under supervision of a clinical psychologist. And we saw whether or not it made a difference to their mental health, how quickly they could access the intervention. Parents were also able to get some help, because if you've got a child who's poorly and in hospital, it's very stressful. Siblings for the same reason. Yeah, and I would say it's definitely been one of the most fulfilling things I've done in my career.
And then along that lines, how did clinicians, service users, or the families respond to this model at the surface?
So mix, I'd say. So the families love it. Why wouldn't you? You know, you're there and you're stressed. And in fact, they didn't really want to have sessions immediately in the waiting room. They were busy, but they saw it. They went in, the children and the parents went in, and then we would book an appointment at their convenience, or we would do it over the phone or remotely, or however they wanted to do it. And siblings loved it too. The doctors couldn't get enough of it, loved it. It was fabulous because instead of long waiting lists for psychology, they could just go in. And if they were already seen by psychology, we wouldn't see them. So we were very careful to work closely with psychology at Great Ormond Street, so that this was a complementary service rather than a replacement service, because it clearly isn't a replacement for qualified clinicians, and some of the children are very complex. So I think the clinicians initially, the psychologists were a bit wary, like, what's this going to do? But I think by working together, for the most part, we overcame their reservations on the whole.
I'm just wondering, for the master students or other volunteers trained in this, how did they respond to seeing people, and was it stressful, or how did they find it?
I mean, I've chosen the sorts of areas I've chosen to go into because I really like seeing results quickly. I think that's my sort of nature. And when you have families that are really desperate for help, and you have, the intervention is in a book, and you have the support, the master's student has the support, and the guidance is properly trained and supported, and families are so grateful, and it can really transform lives. Even just things like, we had a family, and her by the end of the treatment, her daughter brought her a cup of tea because she'd been unable to do that kind of thing or sort of show her love, or she brought her mum her bathrobe. And her mum had been able to go to the toilet by herself for the first time in years without her daughter following, because the daughter had separation anxiety. And those may not sound like big wins, but when you're living every single day with being unable to go to the toilet and have any space herself, actually it's a really big win that her daughter was fine and she was fine for those few minutes. So yeah, we're not taking away the physical health problem or the neurodevelopmental problem, but we're helping people live better lives within those constraints. And I think master's students and others, mostly because people get better with these interventions, found it incredibly rewarding, occasionally stressful, but mostly rewarding.
See, apart from the example case study you just mentioned, were there any, let's say, specific findings in terms of the impact of the project, any numbers or any other examples you give?
Yeah, so actually the project for the Lucy project was in 2 phases. So the first phase was at Great Ormond Street, and if I remember rightly, we had 186 people come in, and we measured mental health for children and young people with something called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, the SDQ, but also quality of life. And we looked at effect sizes, and we got a small effect size for the SDQ and a sort of medium effect size for quality of life. So actually really showing, and it's only pre-post, there's no control group, etc. So there's some limitations to methodology, but people were seen in under 2 weeks and many got better, and they're really very high satisfaction when you measure it with the experience of service questionnaire. Very high acceptability. We then published about mental health of parents that improved as well, and siblings, when we treated siblings, improved. And then a PhD student called Anna Roach then rolled this out across the country and has submitted, and she had a master's student, I think, from your course, who was helping her as part of the project. And those results are being written up for publication, but pretty much the same kind of positive results, and more of a focus in that study on implementation. So why is it implemented in some hospitals and not others? What does it take to translate these research findings into a clinical service? But at the end of that project, UCLH and Sheffield have now incorporated mental health wellbeing practitioners into their clinical psychology kind of service. So having more of that kind of a stepped care approach, and being commissioned to do so and working with the various courses to do so. So I feel that really does make a difference in terms of long-term sustainability. It's not just a research project, comes and goes, you're finished and gone. Actually, in certain centres, it's really been transformative.
And we mentioned the long-term sustainability of low-intensity interventions. What are the next steps for this approach, or what do you see as the future of this intervention, let's say?
So I think one of our principles is that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We have good treatments. It's about getting them to the people in need. And that relates a bit to what I was saying before about the perfectionism and the personalizing. It needs to be personalized. They've got a long-term health condition. It's not irrelevant, but equally, it doesn't mean that you can't apply the interventions that have been shown to work for anxiety, depression, behavioral problems to this group. And I think that's really what we've shown. And I think that principle in terms of the future and low intensity interventions, I hope people don't try and reinvent the wheel anymore, that they take what's already out there and they apply it to populations, they evaluate it properly and rigorously, so that'll be a lot quicker than trying to develop something new. And I don't think we need to develop something new, but I think the way that it's going in terms of the future, it's going in different directions. I think that it's going in the direction of modularity. So we did another big study on mental health in children with epilepsy. It wasn't low intensity, but it was that same principle of applying these interventions for children who had epilepsy. And it was this was a randomized controlled trial, had very positive results. It was published in the Lancet. So that was a really good kind of impactful thing to have a mental health trial in children with long-term conditions in a really mainstream, high quality journal. But that was modular, that intervention. So that's the idea that you have this core of an intervention, and you personalize it by having different modules, and that you use data to determine, where they're making progress and what you need to do next. So I think data-driven modularity is going to be more and more common. There's lots of efforts in the States to kind of go single session or one at a time, session therapy, so that increases access. But it is a challenge of how you can really be efficient and give as little as possible with a maximum result and give people enough, because we also know if you give people too little, they don't do as well. So there's some efforts about using data to kind of predict what works for whom. But really the future, I would say, is AI. AI is, and the data from AI is going to transform interventions as we know it, and certainly low intensity interventions.
When we talk about AI, how do you see it being incorporated in the interventions that we have?
So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever used ChatGPT when you feel low. So, have you used it?
I'm aware that some people do use it when they feel low and speak to it as if it was a therapist.
Yeah. And, I think that needs improving, because you've got to think about what are the data that AI are using to generate those therapeutic responses. Can we make sure that they're doing it ethically, and so on? But it's very immediate, it's very there, and you owe it nothing, and it's free, and it's got lots of positives. So I think there's lots of issues about the ethics of AI. There's lots of issues about the data to make sure that the advice it's giving you is optimal. And not giving you misinformation. So there's a way to go, but I think it will be part of the therapist's repertoire in that way, but also in terms of making notes, and the admin side of it will be helpful. So yeah, I think that there's lots of potential for AI in therapy, but clinicians have to be open to it. That's the thing. It's a bit like, session by session measures. We get trained as psychologists in particular ways, and I'm not sure the courses are always keeping up, but actually there should, I think, in training, there should all now be something on AI. There should be something on how to use it ethically, because it's here to stay.
Yeah. I guess apart from the administrative tasks, it could also be like monitoring people's progress using
Yeah,
apps
definitely.
or
Yeah, so session by session measurement, monitoring progress, but sort of being in the here and now and giving, there's evidence-based advice and guided self-help. So actually it could be a guide, so you can have, the intervention. The issue is about people sticking to it, right? And you can do it for a moment, but it's that same thing that we do know there is a dose responsiveness effect, and that some people do need more. But what you want to do is identify the people for whom that's enough, to free up the people for whom that is not enough and can access more traditional services. And that's this, all of these statistics about how prevalent mental health is, all of these, and it's about resilience, isn't it? It's about having early intervention to build resilience. And I think the field of clinical intervention and resilience are far too separate. And actually, it would be really good to bring those areas together, to have more of a joined up approach, because having low mood, having anxiety, even at pretty significant levels quite early on, if you can master that, it can build resilience, I believe, for future difficulties. But we need to join it all together.
So joining the field of resilience and clinical, and then offering the low intensity intervention. Maybe it's self-help, maybe it's guided interventions, perhaps using AI, and then maybe incorporating human contact as well, providing that step care before it gets too severe.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things that'd be really straightforward to do would be to measure resilience for those that have had the low intensity or ChatGPT or AI intervention in a long-term study. That would be a really interesting thing to do. Does intervening early using some of this low intensity in AI protect against longer term development of disorders? I don't know if someone's done that research. If so, that would be good to get them on the podcast and ask them about it.
It sounds a really interesting project. Now, if we move on to the next section of the podcast, beyond your research, you also co-founded Bespoke Mental Health, which provides low-cost training and evidence-based interventions for NHS, charities, and universities. Could you tell us more about how Bespoke Mental Health fills gaps in mental health training?
Yeah. So after I did my perfectionism work at Oxford, I then went to Reading, where I was the Charlie Waller Chair in evidence-based psychological therapy. And Charlie was somebody that died by suicide. And his parents set up the Charlie Waller Trust to try and help clinicians and doctors and others treat mental health problems better. So for them, it was they wanted to have something about training clinicians. And I had been involved in the BABCP, which is the CBT Association, and setting up symposium and the scientific chair and doing all of that work. So I was quite well networked. So what we did in the Charlie Waller is I got one of my friends to give a workshop, and he did as a favor. He didn't get paid for it, and we used that money to then pay other speakers to give workshops in person, because it was pre-COVID, and to train clinicians. And we set up various courses. And when I left Reading, which I did, it was pretty successful, and Talking Therapists had come along and was doing all of that as well. And then what happened in COVID was, I mean, I'd always been upset that NHS money was spent on training clinicians in therapies that didn't have an evidence base. I felt it was wrong to do that when so many people weren't being able to access the therapies that worked. You know, this problem, so many mental health disorders can't access therapies that work. And then when they finally get to the service, they get given something that is not recommended by the National Institute of Health Care Excellence. And it always bothered me, the admin involved in, you just would go to your boss and the boss would say, oh yeah, you can go, you can go, you can go, with no kind of criteria. Is this evidence-based? So anyway, with two of my colleagues from the Charlie Waller Trust, Pam Miles-Houghton and Sarah Liddell, when COVID struck, I just said, look, this is a really good opportunity to take that model of a workshop and to do it online, right? And got all my friends and colleagues all over the world who I know do these workshops. And if it's online, we don't have to do that traditional model of paying X amount per person for the tea and the coffee and the room hire. And nobody would ever join the right coffee queue. It was all very stressful. Like, that coffee queue over there has nobody. That coffee queue has everybody. Like, go to the one with nobody. So we were doing it. We decided we'd do it online, and we would do it such that an NHS trust or any organisation could buy a subscription, and then all of their staff could come for free. And we knew they weren't all going to come to everything because they don't have that much time off in the NHS, but we felt that this was it didn't cost us anything to invite everybody to come along. They can record it and do it in their own time, and it would be a way of really making sure that the clinicians were trained in the therapies that worked, and we would only put on training that had a strong evidence base behind it. And we started with 5 trusts or organisations, and asked them what they wanted, what kind of training they wanted. And I think in that first year there were maybe, I want to say 20 events or something. And now, it's probably 4 or 5 years later, it provides training to 75% of mental health trusts. It is trained in all different areas. I mean, it's not the solution, because actually what's important, and I think the research would show, after you go on a workshop, you do need some support to implement it. It isn't just a workshop and that's it, you can do it. But there's something about having a critical mass of people from one organisation trained in it, which Bespoke Mental Health allows, that means that they can do peer supervision and it's more likely to be implemented. So that's how Bespoke Mental Health came about.
And you mentioned just now that you tried to tailor that to the specific trust and have helped them organize peer supervision. So I'm just wondering, how do you ensure that the training that you provide or the support afterwards remains practical and applicable for these clinicians specifically?
So what it is more is we go to all the trusts who are subscribers and we say, what do you want training in? And then we list that and then we rank them. And then that's the kind of training that we put on. But we don't afterwards make sure that it's being implemented in the trusts. When we were in the Charlie Waller Institute, we put on clinical skills sessions where people could come for free and they could sort of troubleshoot with patients. It was very poorly attended. So there's something actually about in the NHS, it has to be built into their usual kind of supervision. I think it's hard to get extra time to do extra things, but you would hope, I think, that by having this critical mass, that they in their routine clinical supervision, they've all gone to a workshop, they're more likely to, but we don't go and monitor that afterwards.
Yeah, so it's quite difficult to monitor that. But you also mentioned you'll do a poll in the trust and see what types of skills they want to improve on. So if you take a step back and let's say overall, what skills or techniques would be most crucial or in demand by the trusts?
Yeah, what's interesting still is I think some of the things that if you put on an event that is a skills based, so let's say something like Socratic questioning, or how to have difficult conversations, there'll be people that will come, that's for sure, but it's by no means the absolute thing that people really, really want to hear. What they're really, I think, what now is our most sort of popular or need for training is about neurodevelopmental difficulties, and not just in children, but in adults too. So I think that increasing recognition of neurodevelopment is important. The issues about culture, diversity, and how to consider those in therapy, those are and in supervision, those are important. But quite often it's kind of just the big names that people want to hear. So the people that you've read about, you want to hear what they've got to say. So people like Stephen Hayes on acceptance and commitment therapy, you just want to hear what he has to say, and take it from there. And then some of the ones that I think everybody should be really, really excited about, they're not always. So I know we had somebody called James Pennebaker on, and James Pennebaker has done amazing work on resilience and other things. And I was like, oh, he's just so exciting. He's like, that's like just absolutely. And he's a really funny guy as well. But and I knew it would be great. But it wasn't the bestseller. You know, people come, but it's not the bestseller. So I think there's something about actually it is important to ask the trusts what they want and make sure we do that, as opposed to just, oh, I'd like to hear that. What's important?
So it's not just what's interesting, but also what's in demand within specific
Yeah.
organizations. Yeah.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, similarly to my earlier question, how do you see mental health training evolving in the next 5 to 10 years?
Guess what my answer is going to be?
AI?
Yeah. Um, the, yeah, I mean, it is interesting about, you know, in-person workshops and why people like to go to those. I think people like to go to conferences and meet other people, and it's this all this debate about in-person or online. So I think actually both have a role to play. But I think there's some really interesting innovations in AI in terms of practice patients. So you can have patients with different from different cultures, diversity issues, etc. And you can then really properly manipulate that patient. What would you say to them? What would you do to that? How could you do this? So I think that kind of having a model patient from data and manipulating that and personalizing it again. So actually, this trainee is very good, let's say, at considering issues of culture, but they're not very good at behavioral experiments. So how do we have that patient, not do well in a behavioral experiment scenario, and what happens? So I think there's that element for AI. There's using questionnaires again and data to guide the treatment pathway and treatment decisions. So yeah, I think AI has an important role to play in that too.
It's almost like AI tools could create this virtual environments to test out different scenarios and practice with different types of clients without the stakes of possibly putting someone at risk. Yeah. Now, the last question, what guidance would you give to someone who wants to pursue a career in clinical psychology or being a CBT therapist?
We had a big event last week for the launch of the Pediatric Mental Health Science Centre for lots of master's students were there, and that kind of, it was interesting. We had a panel discussion, and I think we all gave a bit slightly different advice. I think sometimes people get in their head, this is the only thing that I can possibly do. I have to do the doctorate in clinical psychology, and I have to, that's the be all and end all. But it isn't really. And there are so many more options now than there ever were before. I think my basic point, and it's kind of how I do everything, I think, in my life, is I try and gather the information that I need to make an informed decision. So what are the statistics about getting into the declin sci? What are the statistics about getting onto an assistant role or a research assistant role? Have I got that information when I've tried myself? How long have I tried for? What is it about a PWP course? I mean, I've heard some things that people say are things like, oh, I've heard if you know, they think there's only one PWP course. Well, there isn't. There's like loads nationally. So you've got to understand that. And it is confusing on the websites, but you can now ask ChatGPT to explain it all to you really simply so you can properly understand what's going on, which ones are funded, which ones are not, which ones, what do you need if you're not from the UK to take your qualification back? And what does it mean, that qualification back in your home country? And are you okay with that? If you have that, would you be okay? Does that feel like enough for you to embark on a clinical career? So I think it's gathering the information that you need to make a decision. And the other thing I would say, and it's coming up more and more, is like, yeah, well, it's really, really difficult. Yeah, but you've got to do it. You stand as good a chance as anybody else, and not to do yourself down. If you want it, go for it. But be flexible, don't be rigid, and it's the only thing. So flexibility, gathering information, and having confidence in yourself.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise so far. We learned about your groundbreaking work on perfectionism, the Lucy Project, and your efforts to expand access to evidence-based treatment. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or resources you recommend to listeners who want to learn more about your work or about effective mental health interventions?
No, I would just say that I've been very fortunate to have a very varied career. It's taken me in different directions, and there are different ways of doing it. You can be passionate about one thing, but you can just be passionate about the principle of, actually, I want to help people. I want to help people with their mental health, and I'll go whichever way the wind blows, more or less, and where the opportunities come, and see what happens.
Thank you again. To our listeners, we hope you found this conversation as informative and inspiring as we did, and goodbye for now.
The Resilience Research Group is a global group of researchers, practitioners, charities, and organizations dedicated to developing high-quality collaborative resilience research. Our aims are to improve access to, understanding of, and quality of resilience research, and to support and aid our members in effectively developing and disseminating their research. To find out more or to get involved, contact us on Twitter or LinkedIn.